Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing really good and ready for another video. So it's that unique family in the spotlight once again. Well, it's one of them. And actually it's a bit of a sad and difficult topic to discuss, which you've all probably guessed by the title of this video, and that's the death of Fred Weasley. Now guys, I want to talk about every factor relating to his death. We'll talk about how he died, why he died in that way, why J.K. Rowling wanted to kill the character in the first place, how and who Fred's death affected, his last words. We'll even look at how the death was written in the books, and I'll be asking the question, did Fred Weasley actually need to die? So everyone, let's get straight into it. Get yourself comfy, grab yourself a butterbeer, and enjoy today's video. Okay everyone, let's get started. So, Fred Weasley. Fred. What a fantastic character Fred was, along with his brother George. The twins were the perfect example that incorporating humour and trying to see the funnier side of life doesn't always result in being labelled with the non-ambitious tag. The twins were actually extremely bright and were performing impressive spells from the age of 5. Well, for their age, it was impressive. Now the twins were basically inseparable from birth and were clearly each other's best friend, so the thought of them separating and starting their own lives must have come into their head at some point, but never did either of them expect to die and be left without the other permanently. Yet for J.K. Rowling, from the very first moment she created the twins, she knew one of them would die. Furthermore, she always knew it would be Fred. I always knew it was going to be Fred, and I couldn't honestly tell you why, Rowling said. Fred is normally the funnier but also the crueler of the two, so they might have thought, the fans that is, that George would be the more vulnerable one and therefore the one to die. However, the writer goes on to say it was definitely something she didn't enjoy. It was awful killing Fred. I hated that, Rowling said. So poor Fred's fate was written even before his character began to evolve, which goes to show just how much consideration Rowling gave to each character that she wrote to die. Don't forget, Arthur Weasley was also supposed to die until there was a last minute change of mind. The Weasleys were getting the axe faster than we could count, and how would that have affected Molly? She'd already lost her two brothers Fabian and Gideon in the first Wizarding War, something that stayed with her, and she was also set to lose her husband and one of her beloved children. Thank God Arthur was kept alive. He was actually the only decent father in the entire series if you ask me. I think JK wanted to make it clear in her writing how close Arthur was to death by narrowly surviving the snake bite. But there's another person who was left devastated by Fred's death, and that was, you've guessed it, George. The saddest part is that George never fully recovered after losing his brother. He was never the same person. You could even say the George we all knew when Fred was alive died with his brother that day. It's actually a heartbreaking realisation that George Weasley lives his very own mirror of Erised desires every time he looks into a mirror. He doesn't need anything magical to see the face staring back at him because it resembles his brother so closely. I can't imagine how painful it is for one twin to lose their sibling. Now, I can't speak from a personal point of view because I'm not a twin, but there definitely seems to be a very strong bond between twin siblings. It's also quite fitting that George went on to marry Angelina Johnson, who actually attended the Yule Ball with Fred. Angelina and Fred got on much better as friends, and it was through Fred's death that she and George shared their grief, eventually culminating in a relationship between the two. Still, despite George's good fortune with love, kids and his business, life would never be the same without Fred. Now, the manner of Fred's death is something that really bothers me. There are parts I liked, but I think I can see why it happened the way it did, and I'll get to that point soon enough. So let's actually take the text from the book and go through Fred's actual death together. So we'll start with Fred's last words, which were directed at his brother Percy after the latter humorously told Pius' thick niece that he was resigning. "You're joking, Percy," shouted Fred as the Death Eater he was battling collapsed under the weight of 3 separate stunning spells. Thick niece had fallen to the ground with tiny spikes erupting all over him. He seems to be turning into some kind of sea urchin. Fred looked at Percy with glee. "You are actually joking? I don't think I've heard you joke since you were..." The air exploded. They had been grouped together. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred and Percy, the two Death Eaters at their feet, one stunned, the other transfigured. And in that fragment of a moment, when danger seemed temporarily at bay, the world was rent apart. Harry felt himself flying through the air, and all he could do was hold as tightly as possible to that thin stick of wood that was his one and only weapon, and shield his head in his arms. He heard the screams and yells of his companions without a hope of knowing what had happened to them. And then the world resolved itself into pain and semi-darkness. He was half buried in the wreckage of a corridor that had been subjected to a terrible attack. Cold air told him that the side of the castle had been blown away, and hot stickiness on his cheek told him that he was bleeding copiously. Then he heard a terrible cry that pulled at his insides, that expressed agony of a kind neither flame nor curse could cause. And he stood up, swaying, more frightened than he had been that day, more frightened perhaps than he had been in his life. And Hermione was struggling to her feet in the wreckage, and three red-headed men were grouped on the ground where the wall had blasted apart. Harry grabbed Hermione's hand as they staggered and stumbled over stone and wood. "No! No! No!" someone was shouting. "No, Fred! No!" And Percy was shaking his brother, and Ron was kneeling beside them, and Fred's eyes stared without seeing, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. Now here's what I love, the beautiful description of Fred's final moment, how he stared without seeing, meaning his eyes were open even after death. The ghost of his last laugh etched upon his face, meaning he was happy the moment he died, still smiling at his brother. Beautiful, truly beautiful writing. However, I firmly believe that could have been used in combination with any other way for Fred to die. An explosion killed Fred Weasley. Now, at first I was thinking, what a joke. How can you kill Fred Weasley with a pile of bricks? He deserves to go down in a blaze of glory, fighting numerous Death Eaters until the very last moment. If JK is going to kill off one of the most beloved characters, then surely it needs to be more heroic and dramatic. I won't lie guys, I felt like this for a very long time. For years after reading the books, I couldn't see beyond a pile of bricks killing Fred. Then I reread the scene and it became so clear to me. Not everyone needs such a heroic death to be immortalized. Not everyone can have a heroic death because it takes away from the reality and realism of the story. Fred's death was written that way because in life, in battle, even the heroes can die by any means possible. How simple it was for something like an explosion to knock the main characters off their feet. You expect them to get back up, it's part of the story. You expect them to fight on, when sadly, one of them doesn't get back up. That was the point in ending Fred's life how she did, to show that during this war, anyone can die in any way. In fact, it actually makes me angrier to think that callous actions from Death Eaters caused the explosion, which was solely intended to harm, and harm it did. Anyway guys, that was my video on the death of Fred Weasley. Thanks again, have a great day, and always remember everyone, be happy and be kind.